So, like, the first time you played this game, how many of you actually knew who Achilles was? My first exposure to ancient myths came in those comic books you just had in elementary school. Did anyone else have these? Achilles wasn't included among the pile, I think, but now I know about Atlanta. Going back and playing a bunch of Flash games, you notice how simple a lot of them really are. I used to have to play these games for days to complete them. Now I can do it in one session. That's not a bad thing. As a teenager, I was dumb enough to associate being complex with being smart. The opposite sentiment is more often the case. It's something you learn as you get dragged into adulthood. You grow to appreciate the people who can explain something aptly in 7 seconds and 12 words. I can still enjoy a game that requires me to keep track of 15 different things at once while also conjuring up a grand plan for endgame. But playing one session of those types of games takes more effort than 4 years of business school. Most of the time you want to play something that's in the middle, but sometimes you really just want to throw a spear through someone's neck. Achilles, a side-scrolling beat-em-up, and the first major success of Ben Oding. He's the guy that made Warlords. Achilles came out first, and you can see the skeletons of what would become Call to Arms, obviously the art style, and the 3 types of enemies you fight: swordsmen, spearmen, and archers. The basic units of the Warlord games. Combat in this game is smooth, and mostly, you feel like you know what you're doing most of the time, but you can get randomly comboed out by a mob. The bosses are kind of awkward, and the way you beat bosses can feel kind of cheesy. Also, T and Y feels rather uncomfortable on a keyboard. Your main weapon will be a sword. You have a standing attack and a slot machine of a moving attack. There's multiple moving slashes you can do, and they're all activated by the same buttons. They have different ranges and starting frames, and they seem to be chosen at random. Usually this would be bad, but they all roughly do the same thing anyway. I would have liked specific ways to do combos, but then I realized that's kind of needless for slightly different attacks. There's also a kick you can use to stun and spears you can pick up. Spears have one standing attack that's incredibly weak and one moving attack that just chucks the spear in that direction. Throwing the spear is a one-shot on mobs, and you can pick up spears dropped from enemy spearmen, which can combo into more one-shots. This is easily the most fun thing about this game. Everybody gets a free piercing. You have 5 lives, and they must sustain you through 5 areas. Each area has 3 stages. Stage 1 is a small group of mobs. Stage 2 is a large group of mobs. Stage 3 is a medium group, followed by a boss. Most of your lives will be lost during boss fights. You can easily get through the mob stages without much damage taken, but bosses are able to just tank through your attacks and get to you. It's a very simple game. It knows that. The combat is a good core. The base game is fun, and it doesn't have too much stuff beyond the main gameplay loop. It doesn't need to be anything more, but it's open enough that things can still be added to it, which is where we get Achilles 2. This is a sequel in the purest sense. Like, you can see the physical baseline of Achilles, and it's very clear what stuff was added and what things were tweaked. You can now sprint. You have a running attack that can knock people to the ground, and you can stab down to enemies for an instant kill. You can move while blocking now, and you can jump. Enemies are still just the 3 mobs followed by bosses. Archers are exactly the same, but the spear guys can now charge at you, and the sword guys can actually block now. Achilles does feel a lot stronger here. Your moveset is way bigger now. Your attacks are fancier, and you have more specific animations. The game's pacing has basically doubled. Fights are still formatted the same way as the first game. It's still a bit awkward in places, but there's been some improvements. The keys for attacking have been moved from T and Y to K and L, which is way better. Running does feel clunky and out of sync with the camera. The way you perform a stab on a downed enemy is by jumping into the air. The jump has to start and end right on top of the guy on the ground, and enemies can't just get back up. The bosses are much improved, but some of them can still be cheesed. Graphically, you can tell it's based around what we had in Warlords 2, but it's notably better. The visuals of Warlords 2 was a couple of meters too deep into the uncanny valley for my taste. Achilles 2 came out years after and seems to have been polished up a bit. Going from Achilles 1 to 2 had me really dislike how 2 played, but after getting used to it, I can say that nah, the second one is more fun. The simple combat core is still there and has learned how to do a football tackle. The corpses spewing the battlefield just look better and provides a good backdrop. Overall, it's a very solid game. We never got an Achilles 3. Not sure what it would look like as Warlords 3 doesn't really have an art direction, but I assume the core would be the same, and maybe it would be like a campaign through Greece till Troy or something. Maybe something similar to Warlord Heroes. This is easily the best game that Ben Oding has ever made. It has the gameplay from Achilles and the setting from Warlords, so I'm going to be a little bit inconsistent here, as this game can no longer be considered simple. He added a lot of stuff to the core of Achilles 1. In some situations, that can make a game rather bloated, but here it was done perfectly. You can still fight the same way. Attacks are split between a kick, a standing attack, a roulette of moving attacks, and a newly added roulette of retreating attacks. There is now a system of progression. You don't start out with all of your fancy moves. You have to buy them from somewhere. So you have to pick and choose what sounds the coolest and whether or not a piece of armor is a better investment. The biggest thing by far is the introduction of so many new types of enemies and 2 new types of playable characters. We have gone far past just swords, spears, and bows. Every unit from Warlords 1 is here. This isn't even counting the bosses. There's 7 in total and they're all fairly distinct. Some of these enemies will eventually show up in Warlords 2. The game uses the map well. The characters walk across the continent several times, passing every nation. Each region has a set difficulty in the Warlord games. The tougher areas have more powerful units. This has completely transferred over into Warlord Heroes. Regions classified as easy will only have like archers, spearmen, and scouts, while the ones classified as hard will have horsemen doing drive-bys, and the nation's strongest seem to live there. This kind of makes the world feel more fleshed out. Every single nation in this game has a place where nothing is notable. This place is the undead country's equivalent of like Watertown, South Dakota. The playable characters are very distinct. The human swordsman has the moveset of Achilles and then some. He has very short range but is quick and has a bunch of naturally defensive moves. The Night Elf Whirler has incredible reach. He swings his blades in both directions for many of his attacks, and his attacks are quick, but in terms of raw power and damage, he is lacking a bit. The Orc of the South Longswordsman. This guy's moveset would become the baseline for the Samurai in Warlords 2. He has a medium reach, and each swing of his blade does very high damage. But he is quite slow, and many of his moves have a longer than average windup. A neat part of playing each character are the quips they have about the world. Each of them have their own perspectives. The young elf is cautious and is focused on his task. The human is mostly neutral to everyone and doesn't have many strong opinions besides hating on his former kidnappers. The orc is out for vengeance, is very angry, and thinks everyone else is weak. The quips can be interesting to contrast. The story takes place from 3 simultaneous perspectives. A young night elf gets sent as a diplomat to the wood elves, but finds that they have gone blood crazy. He tracks down a demon sorcerer that seems to be doing the make 'em insane spell, but the sorcerer has already summoned a big thing that makes the people go super crazy. This orc is out for revenge, cause the young elf killed his brother when bro tried to rob the elf and failed. He's been on a rampage ever since, killing anybody in his way, trailing the elf along his journey, and he just managed to catch up, only to be stopped by a human prince. The prince has been imprisoned for years by the Human Alliance before he managed to break out. He got back to his kingdom only to realize that his people have gone insane. Trying to find the source, he hears of the young elf doing the same thing, and of the rampaging orc going after him. He decides to trail them as well, and arrives just in time to stop the orc. They somehow manage to talk it out, and they agree to work together to take down whatever the demon sorcerer summoned. Turns out it's a giant demon, and they kill it, which makes the entire continent slightly less angry. And that's the main campaign. There are some things that I haven't mentioned yet, like this came out before Achilles 2, so T and Y are still the main attack keys. Kinda awkward. Also, this. Anyway, that's the game. I can see this becoming a beloved indie game if expanded upon even further, maybe like a general campaign for each nation or something. Alright, next is finally Mud and Blood.